Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Shifting the Paradigm. I'm Cristina Gomez, your hostess for this next hour of adventure and UFO shenanigans, where we look and think outside of the proverbial box, jump down rabbit holes, and where the red pill is actually a red tic tac. Hi to everyone in the live chat today. Jamie, Great Chorl, R&R, Spaghetti Lee, how's everyone doing? Thank you so much for the super chat. It says Christina Gomez. I never found out if you're a silky. I don't even know is that a mermaid? Oh, dude, mermaids are awesome. I'm not gonna lie. I like mermaids. Today's guest, Micah Hanks, is no stranger to shifting the paradigm as he was last with us in July. With more than a decade in podcasting, travel, writing, and research, and the study of history and science, Micah Hanks has more than just a passion for knowledge. He is a longtime advocate for scientific research into UAPs. He's an affiliate member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and has other interests, including space studies, zoological mysteries, and unusual phenomena in nature. A hopeful skeptic, he advocates a critically minded approach to the study of these subjects. With all that being said, let's bring in our friend, Micah Hanks. Hey, Micah.
How are you, Christina?
I love having you on. It's awesome that you can be here again today.
Yes, indeed. Especially since I am a globetrotter at the moment, and I don't mean basketball. I've been all over the place. South America this latest stretch, and it's been beautiful. In fact, specifically, I've got to tell you about Chapada dos Veadeiros, where I was, this beautiful
Uh-huh.
national park. I loved everything except for the tremendous wildfires that were actually, creeping up on us as we were trying to hike our way down into these ravines and find these waterfalls and things. But you would be interested to know, Christina, that there are UFO sightings galore there around Chapada and in Alto Paraíso, where we were staying, the little town. All the little town, shops and things on either side of the main street are decked out with alienígenas, aliens. One little shop was called Area 51. There are restaurants. There was even a hotel that has a great big flying saucer out front. So I felt right at home.
Did you visit all those places?
I went to as many as I possibly could. And, interestingly, we may have had a sighting of something on our way in. I was traveling with my friends, Fernanda and Rafaela. And as we were coming in that night, we had flown into Brasilia, the capital city, and we had to drive about 3 hours out, way out into the country. I mean, you're in the country no matter what country you're in, when as you're driving along in your rented car, you're seeing people pass you on the road on horseback. Okay. And that's exactly what happened. But indeed, we saw off in the distance on this beautiful clear night, we could see Jupiter over here. We could see, I believe, Venus behind us as well. And of course, just an abundance of stars. But then there's a little blue moving light. And a blue light, of course, always will catch your eye if you're an avid nighttime sky watcher, because you don't see that typically on aircraft. And about the time I spotted this, Rafaela in the front seat had seen this before I did. But I'm watching this little light just blank out and disappear. Now, it could have been a satellite. I've seen a lot of those over the years. I don't know. It looked peculiar, so I'll suspend my judgment, but it was interesting.
Oh, I can't imagine. I mean, Brazil is such a beautiful country. My mom used to tell me stories about how when she used to visit, just and the food, don't even get me started.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Comida is, what they call their traditional food there. And this usually consists of, some kind of meat, but also black beans, rice, farafa, which is a wonderful little grain. They also serve a lot of things along, that would be unfamiliar to most in North America and other parts of the world. You'll see a lot of, for instance, yuca and bananas and things served in interesting ways. A lot of different kind of regional dishes that I really enjoyed. Didn't have anything down there that I didn't like. I'm definitely going back. You should come along next time. Let's jump in the TARDIS and go. Okay.
Let's go. Let's go. I mean, I'm always down to eat some plantains, some grilled plantains and fried yuca. Oh,
Yeah.
Micah, don't. Okay.
Yeah. I know.
Don't open that rabbit hole. But you've been so busy since last time we spoke. And aside from your international travels, can you update us at, what you've been doing with research projects when it comes to UFOs and cryptids?
Well, as far as UFOs, because I know we're going to speak about the latter quite a bit tonight, so we'll start with
Okay.
UFOs and UAP. It's an ongoing interest I've had for more than a decade in the history of this phenomenon and trying to document that. And also with an aim toward trying to educate people who are fairly new to the subject about its provenance. I think this is vitally important because, as we have seen with the recent report that was issued to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence back in June, they talk about, for instance, the U.S. Air Force's relatively recent history of involvement with the phenomenon. Of course, they're talking about updated procedures for documenting UAP, and these new reporting mechanisms were first instituted actually by the U.S. Navy, I believe in 2019. The Air Force picked that up the following year and late in that year. So, really, again, indeed, in terms of recent history, the Air Force does have limited involvement. We go, of course, back to the 1950s and 60s, and we see Project Blue Book, and we have the longest systematic study ever carried out by a branch of the military or anyone in government for that matter. And so I'm certain that those who are currently heading the Navy's UAP task force, and again, if it ends up being approved, this UFO study organization or entity that Congress has now called for, which presumably will replace the UAP task force if it comes to fruition, I'm sure they know about the history of the phenomenon. But what concerns me is that they aren't addressing that in the recent dialogue and the reports and the documentation. Many seem to be leading with the presumption that, well, we're going to look at recent reports, going back maybe to 2004, but especially just the last couple of years. And therefore, if there's a technology, well, somebody must have made it here on Earth. Unusual technologies, very unconventional aerial objects have been observed at least since the 1940s. But again, there's a good history going even further back than that. And my contention would be that we need to look at that history and we need to understand the broader picture of what UAP might represent, because it may be easier to say Russia or China today. But if similar objects with uncanny capabilities were being seen in the 1950s or the 1940s or even the 30s or the 20s, it's much more difficult, I should say, to attribute that to a foreign power or even to U.S. technology. So again, understanding the history is really, in my opinion, one of the ways that we define what this phenomena is, and therefore how we should study it, and what we might expect about future studies.
And what about any research projects when it comes to cryptids?
Well, the term cryptid, for anyone who's unfamiliar with that, has to do with animals unrecognized by science, but which nonetheless there have accumulated enough, anecdotal reports, eyewitness sightings that seem to support the existence of some of these creatures. Cryptozoology would be the broader, term for this kind of study. And although, most academicians would label that a pseudoscience, my contention is that every year new animals are being discovered, and they aren't, mythic type creatures, dragons or things resembling what we'll discuss a good bit today, Sasquatch, but they are nonetheless new discoveries. And I feel that, our Earth is probably keeping tucked away in the shadows or perhaps beneath the ocean depths a lot of secrets. Some of that extends to UAP too. But as far as, my own interest in that topic and things I've been involved with in recent years, I actually joined one of the most bright and well-spoken scholars on this subject, Matt Pruitt, my friend of Nashville, Tennessee. He and I and a group of other researchers actually went to Georgia. Skeptical though I am about this, but we spent several days hiking up into the mountains of northern Georgia, and conducting nighttime reconnaissance and work in a large wilderness area where many people, including Matt, he has never seen anything, but he has heard unusual vocalizations that he couldn't identify. A lot of people in that region have encountered, what they claim are human-like creatures that they couldn't identify. And, that's long been an interest of Matt Pruitt, certainly of mine as well. Skeptical though I am about the possibility that there are creatures running around down here in the North Georgia mountains that resemble Sasquatch, um, I am in, I'm very interested in a lot of these reports. And I think the worst thing that you can do if you're truly of a scientific inclination is to dismiss them out of hand without doing your own investigation and actually trying to gather data from those who say that they've had those experiences. So we did. We went down there. We spent several days in an area that Matt spent years working. We didn't hear or see anything, but it was definitely an interesting experience. Did encounter a very large rattlesnake, not going to lie.
I mean, snakes are kind of scary, especially in the wild.
I'd be more concerned about rattlesnakes like that than I would the purported relict hominoids that we were in search of, and we can talk about that term a little later. But I'll also say this, the great thing about rattlesnakes, I know this sounds crazy, but unlike other poisonous snakes, they let you know when they're nearby. And they're intentionally trying to keep you away and let you know that they're there so that they don't get stepped on and so that you don't get bitten. So, and this guy, fortunately, I saw Matt walking right next to me, and all of a sudden he does this unique dance move, kind of spins and turns with one leg in the air. And yeah, we were all fortunately wearing, protection on our legs and everything. But
That's
yeah,
good.
he nearly stepped on this guy. So yeah, no joke.
I mean, definitely when it comes to hiking, wearing snake boots or kind of any of that kind of protection is incredibly important because you don't know what you're going to be stepping on. And for today's topic, it is the others, which are non-human intelligences and encounters with Bigfoots and cryptids. So there's definitely been a lot of talk and discussion with the connection between Bigfoot with UFOs and of them having a really high intelligence. Can you give us an overview on your perspective on that?
Yeah, I certainly can. Again, the first interesting paradox to me is that there is so much interest in UFOs right now, and it's easy to see why. Really, this is in large part on account of the fact that the United States military and other, governments around the world and other militaries now, they are very seriously looking at what they have only identified as far as being objects that can't be identified. And if we look at the ODNI report, of course, they kind of split that into several categories, of which we have aerial clutter, maybe natural phenomena, maybe technologies that aren't recognized. They could belong to another world power, maybe it could be experimental U.S. technologies, the kind of stuff that Skunkworks, is cooking up out there on the West Coast or what have you. But what seems to be the conclusion, again, more broadly, is simply that we do have things in the sky that our military can't identify. And it wasn't a big surprise that within weeks after the issuance of that report, which was very vague in terms of any actual clear determinations it made, we've seen reporting in, for instance, The Guardian in recent days talking about people who claim to have had experiences with the intelligences or the entities, presumed to be in control of these aircraft. Our own The Debrief actually recently featured an article by former New York Times reporter and an award-winning reporter, of course, Ralph Blumenthal, who co-authored the 2017 article about the Pentagon's UFO program, ATIP. But now Ralph, of course, writing for The Debrief, looking at, people also say that they've met those who claim to control these craft. It's interesting to me that many look at that and they seem to be very warm toward the idea of extraterrestrial visitation. And yet the idea that there could be intelligent species, perhaps even human-like species right here on Earth that remain undiscovered by science, people just shun that. They exclude that possibility. They call it myth, folklore, or simply insanity, if not absurdity. Yes, we're talking about Sasquatch here. This is an idea that much of modern science has no time for, while we see scientists now saying, well, maybe we're being visited by extraterrestrials. To which I say, let's hold our horses. I'm very interested in the possibility that Earth could be visited by ET, and that maybe that could be a solution to the UFO issue. But we don't have any direct evidence that correlates those two phenomena yet. We may in the years ahead. On the other hand, if we look at the paleoanthropological record and we look at early human ancestors, archaic human types like Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, if we go even further back and we look at some of the presumably extinct varieties of the greater primate family that existed during the last geological epoch, the Pleistocene, Gigantopithecus blacki, specifically, we have large megafaunal apes, which according to some estimates may have actually been bipedal like we are. And again, these seem to be a very good match in the ancient past for what some people claim that they still see today, particularly in the Pacific Northwestern United States. But there are counterparts in other parts of the world that include, for instance, the Himalayas in Nepal and other, countries in that area. And then there are other varieties also in parts of Eurasia, extending as far west maybe as Pakistan, and extending on down into the Eastern world as well. These would be known by different names, but in sum total, they all are essentially described as being the same thing: hairy, man-like, primitive creatures. And there's an abundance of literature and myth and folklore, and even in modern accounts by some scientists that seem to corroborate with this idea that there may have been recent survival of hominins or early kinds of hominoids, and hence the idea of the relict hominoid. This is basically a fancy way of describing creatures like Sasquatch, in the sense a relict is an animal believed to have been from the past and would be presumed to be extinct, but which may have actually persisted until fairly recently. Hominoids essentially having a human-like shape but not being human. There's a surprising amount of data in support of their existence, and so it baffles me, Cristina, that we turn our nose up at that prospect when in fact that doesn't fall outside of things known to exist in the fossil record, whereas we don't have direct evidence of extraterrestrial visitation yet, although I strongly suspect at times they may have been here and UFOs may represent that. But again, scientists are all too willing to jump in now and look at that because the military says it's important. I think we need to open our minds a bit.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing that they've gotten an interest in it now. And there were definitely a lot of things that you touched on that I want to dive in a little bit deeper. But before we do that, I want to thank Azofa for the super chat. Thank you so much. And he actually hit a point that literally my next question. So it says here, a Russian former MOD member claimed a hairy representative of the other world once appeared before guards at Zargat aerosol, drank water, and then vanished. So, my question to that is, with Bigfoot having a really long history with tribes and people from around the world, but they never found any bodies or bones or fossils, right, from all of the excavations. Many have speculated of them being able to jump between realms or dimensions, or even have speculated teleportation. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any theories?
Certainly, and I also have to give a shout out to Jazz Shaw, my good pal, who's there in the chat. Lots of familiar names and faces there, and glad to see everybody. Please support Cristina and her work, by the way, and if you can, do so monetarily. I do. You should also, but anyway, all public service announcements aside, I do have theories about the apparent paranormal abilities that are ascribed to these animals at times. At first, I do want to back up very briefly and just note that in my response to your last question, I think most would probably be expecting I would be talking about, are these creatures from UFOs? Are they representatives of, said UFOs? Note I didn't respond to the question in that way. And the reason why is because, again, the comparison I see between UFOs and these creatures is one of, why are we seriously studying one which seems more out there conceptually? The other, to me, depending on how we frame the debate, it's not a far out there concept, and yet it is ridiculed customarily. We've seen a glass ceiling break with UFOs, so the most important relationship between those two subjects to me is seeing a similar glass ceiling breaking about this topic as well. But as far as their abilities, again, this is something that we often see described. People claim that Sasquatch and similar animals they believe that they've observed, have these kinds of, liminal abilities. They can disappear at will or become invisible or something along those lines. Again, I have to cite the work of my colleague Matt Pruitt, who has spent many, many years studying large predators, the likes of lions, and tigers and things like this. And in cultures where those animals actually exist, you see very similar belief systems about them being liminal creatures, which are able to kind of traverse realities, which maybe can move silently, or that they possess other kind of unique characteristics. It is my contention that there are good qualifiers in indigenous American traditional folklore that probably represent what we would know as the modern Sasquatch, or what we would call the modern Sasquatch. Among various different tribal groups in the Pacific Northwest, like the Klallam, we have the traditions of Siatko, known by other names, but which generally are described as large, hairy giants which stink. But now that all kind of fits into our scope of modern biology. But the Siatko were also said to be able to be ventriloquists. They could throw their voice. They were said to be able to hypnotize animals, and this is how they hunted. Now these, are where we start getting into the slightly more extraordinary capabilities. According to some accounts, the Siatko also were defined as, spirits that haunted watering holes. If we were to try and think about what exactly is going on here and why these kinds of things are attributed to a large animal, again, according to my colleague Matt Pruitt, we would need to look no further than the way that people have treated animals like lions and tigers. A large animal, and yet they can move almost silently through the forest. You don't know that they're there until they're right up on you. Really, what we're describing aren't paranormal abilities. What we're describing are adaptations by a large predatory carnivore, which, if it can't move silently, it can't hunt. If it can't hunt, it doesn't survive. And so, again, another interpretation is that some of the behaviors of animals, even large mammals, at times can seem supernatural, and many cultures have attributed those kinds of supernatural characteristics to known large animals, predatory carnivores, but they aren't really supernatural. We can have a lion or a tiger in a zoo, and we know a lot about the biology of these animals and their behaviors. But it is interesting to see that that tendency to attribute supernatural abilities to animals is something that we find throughout time, and it also falls into the scope of how known animals are treated. Doesn't surprise me that something unknown to science might be given similar attributions.
So then why do you think that at least publicly there haven't been any remains of Bigfoot that could be studied?
That's a very good question. But again, if we look back at the paleoanthropological record, we have found in many instances where early archaic ancestors of humans did appear to engage in intentional burial of their dead. I produce a podcast all about this topic in addition to my main show, the Micah Hanks program. And this supplemental podcast is called Sasquatch Tracks. And although we haven't aired this latest episode yet, the team and I recently sat down and spoke with Gareth Patterson, who is a researcher who in South Africa has studied elephants for many, many decades. It's interesting because, as with other animals, Gareth has noted that not only do elephants, as large as they are, remain incredibly elusive, and he has studied for decades a variety that was believed to be all but extinct, essentially, until people started seeing them and reporting that they were seeing them again just a few years ago. But Gareth also, during his time in the bush, has observed on many occasions, South African, what again we could only call hominoids, Sasquatch-like creatures, and he's written a book called Beyond the Secret Elephants that talks about this. But again, Gareth also talks about the fact that another of the unusual behaviors that elephants engage in, which he has observed many times, is that they tend to bury their dead. And in one instance, he knows of a human being who was actually buried under a bunch of brush that was believed to have been dead. The human had fallen, I think, off of a vehicle and had been injured. Elephants came along and covered it. And so we found this fascinating because, again, there are a variety of different animals which engage in that kind of behavior. We know from archaeological evidence that early human ancestors engaged in the burial of their dead. So one mechanism for understanding, and again, this is only one because there are a lot of problems with the absence of a body when it comes to the idea of Sasquatch, but one mechanism for explaining this might be that they too bury their dead. And again, I would find it hard not to consider that, given the descriptions of these creatures and being so human-like as they are, even if they are, again, animals, all but in appearance, they very well may engage in some human-like behaviors, much as elephants do, and that could account for why we don't have bodies. But it is still a challenge to science to suppose that we don't have a specimen yet. So many people claim that they've seen these creatures, and yet we've never found a body. But again, I'd also point out, and I know this from experience, I see black bears pretty frequently here in the southern Appalachian Mountains where I am. Never have I found a body. Only on one occasion have I ever actually found the body of a deer, which died presumably a natural death. And I found it because I was crawling around back in a thicket one time when I was a kid, like a crazy person. So it is indeed possible, I think, that if we have an animal species that is in small enough numbers, if it's intelligent, if it buries its dead, and if they largely habitate in areas, if they live in areas where people are unlikely to go, these might be factors that would contribute to the lack of the body. But again, I still recognize that as a tremendous challenge to science, and one of the reasons why I'm still a bit hesitant to go all in and say, okay, yeah, I think these things are out there.
I think that's a very thorough theory onto why people are not finding these bodies. I think it's can be accepted. Now, there are a few super chats I want to address. First of them being Jazz. It's so good to see you, Jazz. Thank you for being here. It says, so glad to see Micah here talking to this channel. If you don't already follow all of his online shows, you are missing out. I learned so much from him. Jazz, I'm happy you brought that up. And the Micah Hanks show is probably one of my favorite podcasts. And I'm not saying that just because he's here. I even tell him that in the private chat. But like when I'm driving, I will listen to it. He has awesome guests, he has great questions, and all of his links are below. So you guys are missing out if you don't know who this guy is. I'm so serious. Jamie, thank you. It says, Micah, what are your thoughts on Dr. Matthew Johnson's claims that the Xenu can transform into orbs and regenerate themselves inside of trees.
That's a good question, although I'm not sure that I'm familiar with the Janu or Zanu. I'm not familiar with that. If JM can elaborate on that in the chat, we could come back around to that. Now, I will say this though, that I've talked to a lot of people who, in areas where Sasquatch are purportedly seen, there are sightings of these kind of orbs or Earth-like kind of phenomena. When I say Earthlight, I'm referring to what are presumably natural plasmas that occur in areas that are seismically or geologically active. We have an area like this very close to my home, which is called Brown Mountain, North Carolina. I am all but convinced that these have a completely natural explanation. In fact, it seems very likely to me, based on the way that witnesses described these objects, that when I was in Chapada dos Veadeiros in Brazil recently, much of the UAP observed in that region, I mean, it is to a T almost identical in description to what we see at Brown Mountain. And I suspect, yet again, that we have probably a natural phenomena that occurs there. Hestel in Norway is a famous place where this happens. But the fact that those kinds of things might occur in areas that coincide with sightings of a cryptid creature or something along those lines, to me, does not necessarily mean that they're connected. Again, we have to remember that fundamental tenet of science. Correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Now, briefly on that point, let me come back to UFOs and Sasquatch again for a moment, because the Freakonomics blog did a really interesting blog post about that a few years back, where they were saying, interestingly, a lot of areas where people say that they see Sasquatch also, happen to be areas where people see a lot of UFOs. So does that mean that Sasquatches and UFOs are somehow connected? Well, again, I think we have to look a little more deeply. What is the single factor that unites those sightings? Well, it's people. And where you have people, that's where you actually have people claiming that they see these kinds of things. But removing the human factor, there doesn't necessarily appear to be any distinctive correlation between the appearances of these phenomena. So again, a lot of things might appear to be related, but you got to ask yourself, really, what is the reason for those apparent, similarities in the areas where these things exist? Is there really a correlation, or is that really just how we look at it? In my opinion, I don't see correlations between the phenomena.
To me, it kind of sounds like if a tree's in the forest and it falls and there's no one there to hear it, did it really make a sound? That's kind of what I'm getting from it.
You're right. Yeah, because again, really, we often put ourselves at the center of everything. I mean, throughout time, humans have long thought, Earth is at the center of the universe and everything circles around us. We tend to really anthropomorphize a lot of the things that we observe. And
We
and again,
do.
when it comes to UFOs, I'll just add this, we should be very careful in terms of trying to ascribe meaning or intention to observations of UAP behaviors. I would say the same goes towards Sasquatch, but in my opinion, if this is a creature, if it really exists, and if they are out there, and if they resemble humans so much in shape, then probably they have followed at least fairly similar evolutionary paths, and therefore they would, in likelihood, be an awful lot like us, being Earthlings. We shouldn't necessarily presume the same thing about any prospective alien life that we may discover in the future, or UAP, should that be what they happen to be.
I think this also kind of sounds like Schrodinger's cat as well. So,
I can
is
see
it?
that
Did it
connection
not?
also. Yeah.
um, Exopa has another super chat. Thank you. And it says, in the Bible, there's a tale of two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Am I saying that right? Okay.
Or
Well,
Esau, yeah.
Esau. Okay. One hairless and smart, one strong and covered in hair. God ended up favoring the hairless one. I have not heard that story. Have you?
Yes, there are a lot of traditions. Again, this is actually very popular among various different religious groups these days. I believe that in the Mormon faith, in a lot of historical literature, there are connections made between the biblical Cain and alleged sightings. One Tennessee pastor in the 19th century claimed to have been riding along when he encountered a hair-covered man running in the same direction that he was going, and that as he came upon him, it became clear to him that he had seen that scourge of the earth, the cursed one, Cain. Well, modern proponents of the existence of Sasquatch have tried to kind of appropriate that tale and say, well, he actually saw a Bigfoot. For all we know, maybe he did. But again, I would say that really, if you look deeply at, for instance, Mormon literature, you actually see a lot of similar accounts. And really what they seem to be is, a call back to that tradition. But I mean, I have seen a lot of people try to make those sorts of connections. You see similar things with the Nephilim. To me, those connections are interesting. but I think that many of them may be superficial connections. Again, my treatment of the Sasquatch subject is strictly in terms of paleoanthropology and biology. Interesting though some of those biblical connections may be, I don't know that they're necessarily something that help further our understanding of what the creature might actually represent. Apart from the fact that some people who may have had valid historical observations of these creatures may indeed have interpreted it through a sort of religious lens. And why wouldn't they? I mean, if we look back through ancient history, going back to antiquity, there are reports of strange phenomena seen in the skies described as, angels, as heavenly bodies. They very well may have been descriptions in early times of UAP, but again, through the ideologies of the observers at that time, they were interpreted as religious phenomena. And indeed, many UFOs that are seen in modern times are described by people as being, oh my God, I thought it was the end of the world. Oh my gosh, I thought that I was going to die. I thought that Jesus had come back. I mean, no joke. My dear friend, Dr. David Halperin, has gone to great lengths to document the way that there are so many incredible, interesting connections between religious beliefs over time and the UFO experience, and that's certainly something that could apply to Sasquatch also.
I from a lot of stories that I've heard, it's a kind of like you're entering murky water when you're bringing religious aspects to this kind of phenomenon. There are many people that have encountered Bigfoot or UAPs and it changed their spiritual belief, and also vice versa, where they see something and they drop it altogether and they're like, well, now I'm atheist, something like that. So I feel like it's very confusing, and I guess it all just depends on personal perspective on it.
It does. Speaking with Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb, who I believe you've spoken with as well. Avi, he's interesting to me because here's a great scientist and astronomer, obviously very open-minded, and I realize he receives a little pushback for how open-minded he is about the prospect of alien life, its existence, our detection of it, and also extending that to the study of UAP in more recent weeks and months. But Avi also is willing to discuss religion, while maintaining what I believe is indeed a firm grounding in science. And so, no matter how we approach these subjects, I think it's fine to entertain ideas and to address, certain topics and things, and even to be a person of faith, if that's what you believe. That doesn't necessarily interfere with your studies, although I think it can, depending on how it's approached. But I personally find those discussions very interesting.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I find them fascinating. There was one point in my college career when I wanted to drop everything and just learn religion, but it ended up not happening. So tonight on Fade to Black with Jimmy Church, he's having the Bigfoot researcher Todd Stanling on as a guest. Have you worked with or looked into his research and videos of encounters with alleged Bigfoot clans?
Yes, I have. I've never spoken with Todd Standing. And if I am to be completely honest, as I always try to be, I'm not particularly impressed with Todd's claims. Much of the evidence that he provides in support of his claims looks to me like it's fabricated. Now, that's just how it looks to me, and I can't prove that otherwise. But I do know that this is a feeling, a sentiment that's shared by many in the community. I know and I respect Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, and he has even gone into the field with Standing. And doing so again is in no way, and was not interpreted by me as being some sort of an endorsement of Todd Standing's claims. Now, some have said that, even if Todd has presented some very questionable information in support of his claims, that may have been the result of his effort to try and bring broader awareness to it, but that Todd may have actually had real experiences, and that at the end of the day he really believes these creatures exist, and that he may have actually encountered them. And I would say that that's a very distinctive possibility. Often in UFO circles, we see this is actually great, Cristina, how often we're able to kind of compare and contrast Sasquatch and UFOs like this. So, which to me is very meaningful cultural dialogue. But again, in UFO research, we often see people who seem to have had a legitimate observation or experience. And then as the interest in their experience begins to wane a little over time, they may begin to present more questionable claims over time. And then before long, unfortunately, those individuals may, fall somewhat into disrepute because people no longer believe their claims. And it sort of casts dispersion on everything that they have said, and people are no longer inclined to believe anything they say, which is unfortunate because I do think that that's a phenomena that occurs sometimes. Some people have valid experiences, they get some attention for it, and for whatever reason, they want to try and maintain that interest, but it leads to less and less credible claims over time.
And that's what can be really difficult. And I think for a lot of us, a big reason to why we tell stories is to get that, not to only to entertain and to inform others, but also to kind of receive reactions as well. And that kind of feeds us, regardless if it's a true story or not a true story. That's why we share stories, is
Yeah.
for those reactions, but also to educate the public. Matt Frost, thank you. It says, there are no known fossils of the great apes. Also, the mountain apes were thought to be cryptids. I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
Matt is spot on, and thank you for helping out, Matt. He raises a very, very good point right there. Until the confirmation of the discovery of mountain gorillas, in the last century. Well, I'm sorry, in the century before that. Gosh, it's the 21st century. When you're time traveling, tends to get a little wibbly wobbly sometimes. But Matt's correct that in the sense of uh, some modern extant species being once recognized as cryptids, there were legends about mountain gorillas as being man-like monsters. But then they were confirmed and they were actually found. Now, in more recent years, there have been fossil recoveries, as I understand it, of chimpanzees. But he's correct also that many of the extant modern, great apes, they don't have corroborative fossil records in support of their existence. So should we necessarily rule out that Sasquatch exists based only on its absence in the fossil record? But then again, the late Dr. Grover Krantz and others would maintain that indeed, if Sasquatch is Gigantopithecus blacki, we do have that in the fossil record. So wouldn't that be humorous if indeed that, not to make a bone joke there, but again, wouldn't it be funny if Sasquatch actually is represented in the fossil record or something similar to it, and yet many of the existing great apes today, we don't have them. I'll also just say this: look at how seldom Homo sapiens sapiens appears in the fossil record. Now, we have fossil human remains, but if you go online and do a search, you'd think that we just have them coming out our ears. They actually are much less frequent discovery than you would probably think. And again, we won't talk about it now, but again, the requisites for fossil formation are quite rigorous. In my opinion, the majority of species that have existed throughout the course of the existence of our planet probably have not been represented in the fossil record. We've only seen a small fraction.
And while we're on the topic of that, going back into not really being able to find any fossils of Bigfoot, then people just begin to believe that it's an absolute hoax, that there's no real evidence, nothing tangible, then it can't be real. But what do you say to that?
Well, again, I would just say if you think that its absence in the fossil record is evidence of absence, in other words, that the creature is, and this again, I'm kind of paraphrasing an idea that is often discussed in the sciences. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but those who would try to say, well, we don't have, actually, let's run down the list really quickly. This could be fun. Okay, no Sasquatch in the fossil record. Again, we've already kind of outlined this with Mr. Frost's help. There are plenty of animals that exist today that we know exist, but which we don't see in the fossil record. I would say that there are a few contenders, not just Gigantopithecus. Again, many of the descriptions of Sasquatch seem to be a good match for or its kindred around the world, like the Eurasian almasty, the Yeti, as described in the very various portions of the Himalayas and whatnot. And there are other varieties too. But again, some of the descriptions also seem to match ancient human archaic ancestors, the likes of Paranthropus, maybe even Homo erectus, and possibly others. In Sumatra and in the Indonesian world, we have stories of what are known as gugu indigenously, but of course, we in the West would know this as either one of the names, of course, that it is known by is orang pendek, and there are other varieties too. But what we also have in the fossil record in fairly recent discoveries is Homo floresiensis, the Flores man, hobbits, essentially, small hominoids, or hominids, I guess they would have been. But again, it's interesting that we have legends and traditions about diminutive, hair-covered people who live in the forests in that part of the world. And in the fossil record, we seem to have something very similar. So again, to those who say nothing in the fossil record, I would say look a little more closely at the fossil record too. There's nothing in the historical record. If these creatures existed, they wouldn't just spring to life in the 1950s with Bigfoot in California, or in the 1920s with Sasquatch in Canada, or maybe in the 1800s with Yeti in the Himalayas and in parts of Tibet, Nepal, etc. But I would say, if we look at the deeper history, and this is a project I've been involved with in recent years, I've found accounts of hair-covered, very large individuals in, for instance, China, going all the way back to the Warring States period, right? maybe back as far as around 200, 250 BC. We find accounts throughout the Middle Ages. We certainly find in indigenous American traditional folklore, the Siatko, like we mentioned earlier. And although some have tried to say that there's no historical evidence in support of the idea of wild men or Sasquatch in America going back prior to maybe the last century, there's an abundance of it going back to the 1900s and maybe earlier. Chad Arment is a historian who has really taken great pains to mine such accounts from historical documented sources and also newspaper accounts. And his book, the Historical Bigfoot, as the name would indicate, is a great treasure trove of, what may be in some cases. You can't rule out hoaxes in every instance, tall tales, newspaper hoaxes, things like that. But again, if one of those accounts represented a real entity, the likes of which we would associate with the modern belief in Sasquatch, it would seem to help establish a historical provenance and one that is a reality. And then lastly, biology. Well, if these things existed, we'd have a body by now. A hunter would have shot one. Well, maybe not so likely, because I've got a lot of friends who continue to say my old gripe exists. A hunter would have shot one of these things by now. But to those who would argue that, I would say anyone who is a sportsman and who has been in the field and who knows anything about, hunting. I don't want to get into a political debate about it right now, but, in terms of the scope of this conversation, they also recognize their quarry. They never take aim and fire at anything that they don't recognize. If I saw an animal in the forest that looked very closely similar to a human being, the last thing I would do is pull the trigger, because I'd be afraid I might be shooting a human being. And this is exactly what many hunters who have purportedly been in that situation have said. Now, again, I still maintain that the absence of a body is a problem. That is a challenge to science, and it's a huge problem in terms of establishing the credibility of the existence of these creatures. But I think that arguments can be made, as we have done in 3 different areas, that help us to understand really that, this isn't so clear cut as many skeptics have tried to make it out to be.
I guess when it comes to all things mysterious, it's never as clear cut as we want it to be either. John Music has a super chat. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that's giving super chat donations today. I mean, and every day. They really help keep my channel going and growing. So I'm always incredibly appreciative. So John says, Micah, a lot of what Dave Paulides researched into missing people and Bigfoot is similar to what Bigelow's crew experienced on Skinwalker Ranch. Tall, large beings stepping out of portals, creatures in trees, stealth, etc. Your thoughts?
Yeah, David Paulides is a very interesting character, and I don't mean that in the pejorative. I actually think he's done a lot of very interesting research. He certainly has kind of carved out a unique niche for himself in this community. Regretfully, I was not able to speak to him, although he and I were both in attendance at a conference back in the summer, about which, Cristina, you and I have talked about a little bit and everything. And, I find David's research interesting, but I feel that, and he would probably agree, he's haunted somewhat by the fact that as a person who now studies disappearances in national parks, previously, he also studied Sasquatch, and very seriously. And David and I have shared actually one particular thread with our research, which is, does the U.S. government, do agencies within the federal government have any interest in Sasquatch? David has tried to establish, answers to that question too, for which I have to respect. I may not agree with all of David's theories and conclusions, but I certainly respect a lot of the work he's done. Now, that said, about, comparisons between Skinwalker Ranch and the missing persons cases. One of the problems with the missing 411 research that David has done is that a lot of people can't differentiate it from his previous Sasquatch research, even though he's tried to do that. And he's tried to say, look, we aren't necessarily talking about Sasquatch here. Although I do feel that that's implied in many of the cases that he has explored and written about. However, anomalous phenomena in various areas, in different manifestations, does sort of, exist in some of the missing 411 cases. I won't get into some of the criteria that David has looked at and some of the patterns and trends that he has ascribed to the disappearances, but he certainly does ascribe some aspects that are anomalous, and it certainly has attracted both the cryptid community. It's attracted some UFO researchers. I won't speak to David's own beliefs, but I do know that David has corresponded with a lot of people who are prominent in UFO circles, like Bruce Maccabee and his wife and others. I think that the instance that the person was asking about there, about people or creatures in trees, and things like this actually references a sighting that Bruce Maccabee's wife had of something that she saw in a tree while she was hunting. And that definitely was interesting to David Paulides. So, again, I don't know if there are explicit connections, but one might say that there are at least some superficial similarities between the phenomena described at Skinwalker Ranch and some of David's writings in his Missing 411 books. And I recommend them. They're interesting reads.
They are, and the great thing about his books in particular, and along with his documentaries, is that he doesn't tell you flat out what he thinks it is. Instead, he collects all the data and allows the audience to come up with their own conclusions. I have never heard him say, "I believe it's Bigfoot. I believe it's aliens."
You're yeah. You're spot on, Christina, and thank you for pointing that out again. David, I think a lot of David's critics read into what he has written and have tried to ascribe, to his thoughts on these issues, things that he has never said. The one thing he has maintained for years is that I'm trying to collect the data and present it without necessarily drawing conclusions, which I realize frustrates a lot of people, but I really like that. That aspect of what he does is great because, again, as a UFO researcher, I got to tell you, I do the same thing. I try to look at the data and analyze the information without drawing conclusions. Look, we don't deny that there's a phenomena when we talk about UAP, but we are far from being able to say conclusively what it is. So, David, I think, is, much to his credit, tried to do the same thing. And so whatever his critics think about his research, what he's actually said is, in a lot of ways, I think, what a good researcher tries to do, what a good scientist would try to do when looking at anything that is apparently real, but which we are far from being able to understand.
And a lot of us, of course, we definitely want the answers, especially in today's age when we all have a tiny little amazing computer in our pocket that can give us all the answers that we need. But when it comes to these kinds of mysteries, no one has all the answers. And I think for those that are researching the topic and just placing data without their opinions or bias, I think should be some of the most valued people in the field.
I agree. Well said.
So while we're on this topic, there are countless TV shows and organizations that are looking into the Bigfoot legend. I mean, there are a ton. And I always ask myself if they're doing things right. Just because as someone looking out, we can always see their flaws, right? But from your understanding, what have you found that in your opinion is tangible groundbreaking evidence?
Well, that's the difficulty. And again, why I've referred to it throughout the course of this conversation as being a challenge. There is very little physical evidence that's unequivocally associated with Sasquatch. But there is some compelling evidence nonetheless, which I think is worthy of consideration. Um, Arguably, the best known is, of course, the footage that was collected in the late 1960s at Bluff Creek, California, by cowboys Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. Roger Patterson died, I believe, in 1972, so he didn't live very long after that footage was made. Many skeptics are confident in already concluding that it's been thoroughly debunked. I'm not so sure to say that I would say that. At one time, I did kind of say, there's even a blog on my website talking about, let's talk about Sasquatch, but leave Patty at the door, because my conclusion was essentially this. The film looks really good, but there are some problems with it. Quite a few problems with it, in fact. And therefore, I don't know that we'll ever resolve whether it's authentic or not. And therefore, it's going to be difficult for us to use this as the cornerstone for our argument that Sasquatch exists. Now, more recently, having reviewed the works of, for instance, the late Dr. John Bindernagel, also the work of Bill Munn, looking at of course, the writings of Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, and a number of others who have, painstakingly examined that film. And this is significant, not just the film, but also the spoor, the castings of the spoor, the tracks that were left on the sandbar where Patty, as she has been known, was traversing. It's important to talk about that very briefly because, again, the film alone looks really good, but the footprints may help us flesh out this story, and that's often left out of the debate. Shortly after the film was made, Bob Gimlin went back to the film site and saw that it was raining cats and dogs and thought these footprints are going to be destroyed. So he starts taking pieces of bark from a nearby, fallen trees that had kind of collected and formed a natural dam there in Bluff Creek, and he starts covering the footprints with bark to protect them. Now, within a few weeks of the footage being made, maybe just a few days, we actually had an independent researcher appear there on site and Bob Titmus was his name. He was actually a taxidermist by trade, but Bob Titmus goes and he also makes castings of the footprints. But right after the film had been made, there'd been one or two castings made by Roger Patterson, the filmmaker, as well. Then, independently from those two, another gentleman who was with the U.S. Forest Service named Lyle Laverty went out there and he photographed the track, the actual track line there on Bluff Creek. The following spring, when John Green reached the site, and I believe probably that same fall that Peter Byrne was on site investigating, but they all saw the track line. And indeed, John had said that, the footprints were deep enough in the sand that the rough area where the actual track line had existed could still be seen that following spring, even though the tracks had eroded significantly. But there were a lot of people who independently returned to the site. They were able to establish the film site. They took photographs there, and they also saw those footprints, and castings were made. When we analyze those track castings, according to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, one of them appears to convey what he calls a mid-tarsal break. Now, if you think about it in terms of the human foot in rare instances actually can bend slightly in the center, but that's not a common feature of the human foot. It is something that we see representative in footprints left at sites like Laetoli and others that ancient human ancestors seem to possess. And of course, modern extant great apes often possess this too. It is the contention of Jeffrey Meldrum that both the Patterson subject and other instances of foot castings in the United States and some from parts of Eurasia appear to display this mid-tarsal break, representative of a slightly more complex and dynamic foot than the average human foot. And in Meldrum's contention, that ability for the foot to have that mid-tarsal break is indicative of a non-human that left those tracks at Bluff Creek. Now, briefly, I'll just also address some of the skeptical, arguments against that film. We know who wore the suit. His name was Bob Hieronymus. He was a retired Pepsi Cola bottler from Yakima, Washington. Indeed, Bob Hieronymus claims to have worn the suit. But when asked initially about the suit that he wore, he said it was made of horsehide and it stunk, and it was a pretty crude affair. There was like a t-shirt kind of top part that came down, and then maybe a drawstring that held the pant portion up. Well, that completely conflicts with the story of Philip Morris, a costume maker from Charlotte, North Carolina, close to where I reside, who claimed that he actually sold the suit to Roger Patterson. Now, when they brought this to the attention of Bob Hieronymus, he said, you know what, actually, yeah, that was the suit I wore. And again, we can recognize the suit from Philip Morris's costume shop because he put photos online. Now, Morris said that there was a zipper in the back. Analysts for years have looked for the zipper in the footage and cannot find evidence of a zipper. And indeed, there appears to be musculature that can be seen under the fairly short hair of the subject of the film. But another problem with that whole idea about the suit and whoever might have made it was that Philip Morris, even when he watched the film and said it was the suit he sold Patterson, Morris maintains, but the suit I made didn't have breasts, and very evidently Patty is a she because she has breasts and rather prominent ones. He said the arms are longer. He must have made arm extensions or something. He said the mask is nothing like the mask on the suit I sold him, so he must have modified that. But I'm confident it was the suit I sold him, when in fact, the way that Philip Morris described his observations of the film, it didn't sound anything like the suit that he sold Roger Patterson. So there are problems with the film, but I would maintain that there may be more problems with the skeptical narratives, which have seemed to try and kind of hobble together all these different ideas and what this guy says he remembers and this guy says he did to try and fit a narrative, which in fact is anything but clear cut. So again, it doesn't move us any closer towards saying that the film is authentic, but I don't think that it's been as roundly debunked as many skeptics argue. Now, sadly, back to your main point, Cristina, that's some of the best evidence we have. There are the footprint castings also, which I think are probably of more importance, really, and not just with the film subject. I mean, they've been retrieved from a lot of areas. But I hope that in the years ahead, diligent citizen scientists and also professional scientists will help to continue to gather data that may move us toward the eventuality of establishing that there is a reality to this.
I definitely hope so. I mean, we can only go up from here, seems like.
Yeah.
Michigan has a question, and it says the UFO report in June talked about various sensors recorded data, but they leave out talking about a specific sensor, sonar. Does Micah have any info on sonar contact with USOs?
I don't have any direct contact or information about contact established using that as a sensory mechanism. But Tim McMillan, of course, my co-founder at the Debrief, along with MJ Benias, Tim and I on the telephone this morning, of course, we're talking about a lot of different things. And over the years, that's something we've looked at. I do understand, or at least I believe that there had been some purported sonar traces of at the time of the Nimitz incident. I don't know that that was established conclusively, but again, I've heard mention of the idea that again that whatever the objects were, keep in mind when Commander Fravor and Alex Dietrich are sent there and they first observe the object moving very quickly and erratically over the surface of the ocean, there appeared to be something underwater as well. Sightings of objects coming out of or going into the ocean and other large bodies of water go all the way back to the Blue Book years, and in fact, a large swath of the Blue Book reports involved maritime UFO sightings and encounters. But indeed, I have heard of detections on sonar over the years, and I can't confirm whether that was indeed a part of the data that was relevant at the time of the Nimitz encounter, although I'd heard something to that effect at some point, and I would like to explore that a little more in depth. I will say this, though. During the Cold War, there was an interesting phenomena, and the Soviet at the time, the Soviet Navy referred to this as quackers or quacker phenomena. Quacker is a expression which was sort of automatopoeia for the sound that these things made, because there were objects that were often observed on sonar by those on board these Soviet submarines, and these things would sometimes come in and circle around the submarines like they were examining them or observing them, and then they'd go and just take off and just vanish from sonar like they moved incredibly quickly. And it made a frog-like kind of croaking sound, so croaker would be another expression for these. But, in English, for some reason, we translate it to be quacker. But yes, indeed, the Soviets did describe that they were being observed, and they looked at a number of different possibilities. Are these a biological organism, something that's taking interest in us? But they said the speed at which they appeared to move seemed to rule that out. They could only say that it was technology, and so therefore it must have been CIA drones. Now, isn't that funny that for decades they say it might be us and we say it might be them? But I'll just put forward for the record Roscoe Hillenkotter, the former CIA director, who in 1961 said, none of our intelligence indicates that the Soviets have a technology comparable to what people say that they're seeing. It's time we take serious the idea that it might belong to someone or something else. I think that remains very true today.
And we've known for a long time that the government just has been so interested in UFOs. But what about Bigfoot? I mean, are there any projects or operations that you're aware of that have been conducted by the government or even by law enforcement agencies in the USA in the pursuit of Bigfoot?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that, because I've spent quite a while looking into that possibility. I've filed Freedom of Information Act requests with a number of different agencies that include U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, even the FBI, the Army. Best I can tell, having spoken with people who worked in some of those branches of government and also having, made inquiries on my own, is that there is no interest that the government has with Sasquatch, although on occasion there are official documentation, in the form of reports and things like that do turn up. I was able, through Freedom of Information Act request, able to obtain a pretty elaborate sighting report that was filed with the National Park Service, which if you just sent them a FOIA and said, give me all your Bigfoot files, you're never going to get anything. FOIA doesn't work like that. You have to be very specific, but I was very specific in one case, and I've tried in others and failed. But indeed, there are government documents that are kept about Sasquatch, but they don't indicate, in my research, any kind of a broader, serious network of investigations that the government has undertaken about that subject. Although I think that there's probably more interest among people who've worked in government than most are probably aware. I've found evidence of, guards at Air Force bases, government employed geologists, National Park Service, for instance, seasonal rangers and things like that. For instance, at Yellowstone, one of the largest and oldest national parks, I've found so much data about sightings by government employees at Yellowstone that I actually reached out to their public affairs and asked them, what is your official position on Sasquatch, whether or not it exists? what would the park's response be to the discovery of a creature like this? And they simply said, we don't think that thing exists, therefore we have nothing to say about it, and we have no official position. So I've definitely gone down that rabbit hole, and I'm still doing that. In fact, there's a project I'm involved with right now that's looking into that aspect of it, but I'll continue to search. But those are my findings to date.
Well, why do you believe that science should care about the study of Bigfoot? I mean, we are pushing for a serious push for UFO transparency and research because they're being evaluated as a possible national security threat. But what about Sasquatch? Why should scientists care?
Well, again, if we look at UFOs and why people care about that, again, there appears to be a technology, not just buzzing around in our skies, but again, FOIA documents that have been obtained by researchers, diligent researchers over the years, the likes of Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett, and researchers who have worked to establish the history of this topic, like Jan Aldrich and a number of others. I mean, there's so many people who have worked so tirelessly trying to help us, illustrate the big picture when it comes to UFOs, at least in terms of what knowledge we have about them. A few things that are clear is that there are, not only are there technologies, but these things demonstrate clear intent. That was the title of a book that Fawcett and Greenwood wrote back in 1980. They demonstrate what appears to be a clear intent to enter controlled airspace. They go into areas where, for instance, nuclear weapons and nuclear waste and things like this are stored. They will go in, they will conduct their aerial operations, whatever it is they're doing, and they will leave. And they don't pay attention to the fact that we have guards being scrambled on the ground, helicopters sent up there to intercept them. These craft don't just fly around in our sky. They enter controlled airspace, which is a direct problem for national security. And that's not just in the United States. I suspect it happens all over the world. We certainly have Canadian officials who describe similar things. Daniel Otis is a colleague of mine in Canada who's been documenting this for Vice Canada. And again, really his focus has been another area that's a threat. UAP in relation not just to the military and military locations, but also UAP as a possible threat, directly or indirectly, to aviation. So even commercial aviation, it's a problem there too. As far as Sasquatch, obviously the government doesn't seem to have very much concern about national security concerns that may stem from the existence of a large hairy relict hominoid. But much like the reasons that we are taking interest in UAP like we are right now and the possible indirect threat they may represent, a challenge to national security as well as a threat to aviators and what have you, I would argue that if there is a large, ape-like creature that exists, however crazy that possibility may seem, there's a tremendous amount of anecdotal evidence and I think a deeper historical provenance for the idea than many people realize. If those creatures exist, that is something I think that we really need to be aware of, both for the safety issue, because again, one of the staples of Indigenous American traditional beliefs when it came to this subject actually had to do with kidnappings. They said these things, if we refer to Elkanah Walker, who was a missionary living among the Spokane, in 1840, I believe he wrote a letter to a colleague where he said, allow me to trouble you with some of their superstitions. The Spokane believe in a kind of spirit that they say are stealers of men. They'll come down into the villages at night and they'll kidnap women and children and carry them back up into the mountains. Again, I leave that to the imagination for those out there, but certainly some of the things we've talked about over the course of this conversation seem to kind of point in that direction. That's entirely speculative, but I'm saying that there maybe are safety considerations, public safety considerations that should be taken seriously. Then on the more positive side of things, I think that biologists, anthropologists, historians, if a creature like this were proven to exist, they would immediately have to see the benefit from studying them. Again, the study of a creature so similar to ancient human ancestors, only known to us in the fossil record, if that were to exist today, that would be a tremendous opportunity, because it would allow us to see something about ourselves maybe and human evolution that otherwise we would never know from just studying fossils. So I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're to treat this scientifically, to establish, before we conclude presumptuously, no, they couldn't exist, it seems impossible, therefore it is. I think it's important for us to say, well, actually, with all this data, let's reevaluate this. And let's determine really whether or not there is a there. And if there is a there, let's look at the public safety implications. Let's look at the implications for science. And let's really see how we can both mitigate problems that might arise from this, but also benefit from the study of them.
I I'm really happy that you said that because it's not even something that arose in my mind, but the fact that if these are studied by scientists, it can help us better understand ourselves. I think that's so beautifully put, and I'm really happy that you said that. Now I'm going to change gears just a little bit, and my next question is, non human intelligence is such a broad terminology. And so I want to get back to the links between UFO sightings and Bigfoot like entities. So, in your opinion, how much of this specific aspect of the non human intelligence topic is being taken seriously? I mean, how many in the relic hominoid community are open to the possibility that Bigfoot have extraterrestrial origins? And what do you feel about all of that?
Well, again, I see no direct links. There are some researchers who have entertained that possibility. I think that Stan Gordon, the researcher based out of Pennsylvania, probably best known for his documentation of the famous Kecksburg incident, but he's documented some sightings that seem to link UFO sightings that apparently coincided with or nearly coincided with Sasquatch sightings. For me, and I a couple of years ago had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum at length about all of this, and the way that he kind of concluded the conversation was the paranormal theories that are being associated with Sasquatch don't necessarily help us establish the topic in terms of being a credible biological issue that scientists might be compelled to study. So, in my opinion, uh, I think that the best way to approach Sasquatch is to treat it like what it seems to be. What it seems to represent is a primate that is more like humans than any other primate known to exist, but which is not terribly different from them in its behaviors. Not incredibly different from us in a lot of ways in terms of the described behaviors by those who have seen it. To go any further than that, I mean, for all we know, Sasquatch very well may have unique capabilities, or there may be more explicit, associations with other kinds of phenomena. But I don't see any compelling reason presently to link them. Now, some would say, but you haven't read, the research of this guy or that guy, and you haven't considered how weird it is. And at the end of the day, we haven't found a body yet. So if these things were out there and they were just animals, we should have a body. There's an argument there, certainly. But again, the problem I have with that argument, Christina, is it becomes more difficult when we take something that is unknown, okay, unexplained phenomena, and we try to use other unexplained phenomena to explain the phenomena. Two negatives don't equal a positive. And in my mind, to say, well, the Sasquatch is easily explainable, they're UFOs. Well, to that I would say, okay, well, what are UFOs? Well, they're aliens. And I'd say, well, where's your proof? Well, we know it's not ours. There you go. Well, I'm sorry, but the fact that they don't appear to be ours is not in and of itself proof of extraterrestrials. And you see, there's a lot of strange kind of circular logic that people employ when it comes to the study of all these sorts of things. Now, there are also those skeptics out there, and I've got a lot of friends who are great skeptics. And so, let me just be clear here. I'm not bad mouthing the skeptics. I count myself among their ranks. I'm very skeptically inclined myself, but there have been some skeptics over the years who have acted as though me or you or anyone who even seriously tries to discuss these topics is thereby actually doing harm by giving even some amount, some measure of credence to the possibility. That is the most anti-scientific idea I could imagine. It's one thing if you say, I know what they are, I believe in them, I've seen them, and they come in my bedroom at night and talk to me. Yeah, okay, that's an extraordinary claim. But to simply have a discussion about Sasquatch or UAP or anything else for that matter that is deemed fringe, to simply have a conversation about it, I guess there's a right and a wrong way to go about it, but it's not inherently wrong just to discuss these things. And anyone who would try to make that sort of association, well, he talks about weird stuff, so he must be crazy, that's an unscientific attitude. And frankly, I take issue with it.
I definitely love the fact that not only do you have a critical mind in the way you understand things, but also you play the devil's advocate. And I think that's a really rare characteristic that people have is that you don't really agree with yourself, but you don't also disagree and you go both ways. And I think that is so valuable in this field and in every possible field that there is. So I want to say thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the intelligent questions you always ask. And, again, when we're talking about having these conversations, And I think this sincerely because I tell you this in private too. But again, conversations like the ones that you host right here on Shifting the Paradigm and any other program that you're producing, you're raising the bar on the discussion by having intelligent guests, asking great questions, having, really thoughtful ideas of your own that you inject into this dialogue, and keeping people interested, keeping people talking, keeping people asking the right kind of questions rather than, spinning off into speculative realms of nonsense. So again, and I don't mean that in any way as an attack against anyone who has beliefs of their own. I mean, if anything, I hope that people who listen to a show like this will recognize me as being their advocate, much as you are, in the sense that I'm trying to have these conversations. And if you disagree with me or you disagree with Cristina, don't forget that it's okay to disagree. But what we're trying to do is take these topics that we all are interested in and make sure that they have a home where they can be discussed seriously, a home where they can be discussed in ways that really are furthering our knowledge about them. But knowledge, again, really relies on a number of things, including evidence-based approaches toward, trying to study them, and scientific principles applied toward this dialogue. So again, we could go on down the list, but really I think we've kind of defined what we're trying to do here. And I think that hopefully will be recognized by all as being in the furtherance of this dialogue.
It is, and that's why you have your own podcast as well, so you can talk about this in depth. And when I'm just really happy that you're here. I'll just put it like that. So John has another super chat. As always, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. We have two going for us. One of them is, it would be different if it was just one or two direct non human events. But obviously, with millions of non humans and aliens UFO sightings everywhere by all types of people over eons, non humans have to be here. Thoughts?
That's an interesting perspective. The human tendency to ascribe agency to various phenomena throughout time is something we've seen for a long time. Again, in antiquity, we might have seen gods, or we might have seen angels, or we might have seen demons, or we might have seen nature spirits or elementals, or ghosts of our ancestors. Any number of different things can be the interpretive motif through which we kind of filter things that we see and experience. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to look at it in those terms, but again, to conclude from the collective human experience and our belief in non-human intelligence throughout time, that therefore that is evidence of them, I might draw a line there. But I would say that, for instance, going back to antiquity and looking at instances of unusual occurrences, prodigious occurrences, fantastic events in the skies and things like this. There have been a number of researchers who over the years have, kind of mined reports from ancient history and even more recent history, the last few centuries, looking for what we might find, or call today in the modern parlance UFOs or UAP. I think that there's a pretty good case to be made there. And so, yes, if indeed some phenomena from the ancient past do end up, I don't know that there's any real way that we'll ever be able to confirm that, necessarily, but if indeed they do represent what we in the future maybe define and study and eventually resolve to be UAP, and they, for instance, are extraterrestrial visitors, yeah, we might say that, yeah, throughout time, there's a pretty good case that we can look back in hindsight and say, yeah, well, we know what these things are now. Throughout time, people seem to have seen these things too. They seem to have been visiting for a long time. And yeah, it seems that indeed they didn't know what they were at the time. They had different names for them, but these turn out to be non-human intelligences. If, and here's the caveat, that's what UAP or UFOs were to turn out to be today. But we don't really yet have enough evidence to support that conclusion. Now, if I had to tell you what I guess, I certainly have entertained that idea. I certainly have entertained that idea like anybody else that, again, this doesn't appear to be a technology that we recognize easily here on Earth. And we can't attribute that to any nation or anybody, let alone our own technologies. And going all the way back to the assessments by Project Sign under the U.S. Air Force as early as 1948. It was destroyed, but there was a document that's colloquially known today as the estimate of the situation. And it apparently said, look, we can't identify this technology, and whatever these things are, we don't even think the Soviets have this, let alone us. So we're open to the possibility it could be extraterrestrial. that's why that document and all copies of it were reportedly destroyed, because top brass in Washington hated that. They were like, "Don't tell me aliens. Get back out there and get back to work," you know. But it's not a new idea, and there's a reason why that idea has persisted. I don't say that that's proof of aliens, but I am saying that, again, I think that as time goes on and that idea remains relevant in the dialogue of what UAP may represent, that should say something, right? That should speak to something in terms of how long lasting that interpretation of the phenomena has been with us.
I would hope so, but as we know, our opinions and our bias definitely skew our viewpoints on any data that we may see. Even
Yes.
if even if the facts are laid out, people are going to be like, "No, it's still wrong."
Yet again, very well said, Christina.
um, Matt Scott has a comment. Thank you so much. And it says, "These creatures are not of the intelligent of animals. It would be much more believable than they are as smart or smarter than us." And that's a really interesting statement. There are people that have encountered these Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yeti, whatever you like to call them. They're all rather similar, that they that they seem intelligent, like as if they can sense people coming before they come. And there's even been certain cases where there have been message relayed telepathically. And I mean, overall, I find this topic so fascinating. There are so many facets to the Bigfoot story that it is very possible that they could possibly be smarter than us, just based off of the stories that people have experienced. Now, again, we don't have them in a lab, at least to our knowledge, so we can't really test their IQ or anything, but merely just based off the stories, it's a really interesting point. What do you
Oh,
think about that, Micah?
certainly. Again, to Matt Frost's you know perspective there about the intelligence of these creatures, I would say maybe, as opposed to being more intelligent than humans, maybe they have a different kind of intelligence. Maybe their variety of intelligence is highly specialized in different ways. For instance, let me give you a good example, looking at archaeology again, of a great mystery of ancient time. And that is, of course, the fabled wonders of the world that they are, the pyramids of Giza. It's easy to see why ancient astronaut theorists, for instance, would look at these things and say, how could anybody 4,500 years ago build monumental structures like this? What technology did they have comparable to what we used to build buildings today that could achieve this? How in the world did they do that? Well, maybe they didn't. Maybe they had some help. To which I would say, okay, aliens. Well, then why do aliens come down to Earth, and comparable to their technological capabilities, why do they come down here and build great big mud pies in the middle of the desert? You know, um, I think really a better way of approaching this is saying that the ancient humans who built the pyramids, and unequivocally, I am of a mind to say that humans built them. And in fact, I think that there's plenty of archaeological evidence that supports that. But rather than having anti-gravity or some sort of incredible technology, they had a very specialized technology. They had a very specialized way of thinking. You want to understand how they built the pyramids. The first question to ask is, why would they build the pyramids? And if you think about their culture and their religion and their ideas and their attitudes and their society, it becomes easier to understand how and why the great trouble would have been gone to. Graham Hancock so often asks in his writings, why go to all the trouble? Well, again, that's an easy question to ask, especially from a modern perspective, but putting ourselves in their shoes, it becomes more difficult. As far as what Matt was talking about, is Sasquatch more intelligent than us? I don't know that we would say more intelligent, but I would say that very much like we could say of different cultures, around the world, and also different kinds of species around the world. Animal life, including humans, are capable of incredible things relative to what they need to survive. If we think about what my colleague Matt Pruitt has said about how quickly a large carnivore can move through the brush, if that ensures a clean, quick kill and it gets to have dinner, that seems almost magical to us. And there's no technology involved. It's an adaptation, and it's an animal that has evolved to be able to move very stealthily, very quickly. It may only be able to do that, within certain parameters, but within those parameters, what it can do, it does with deadly force, unlike any other animal in existence. It would be hard to imagine a creature as large as Sasquatch is said to be able also to evade humans so well, to move silently through the forest, to do some of the things that they seem to do. But again, One might call that intelligence. One might also call that adaptation. And one might also view that in terms of it being very specific to that animal, which to me, again, if we remove our human perspective long enough to say, well, if they're not like us, then we shouldn't presume that they would act and function like we do. It maybe is a little less mysterious. But then again, it's hard to say that there's anything less mysterious about Sasquatch. I mean, if they exist, that's going to be an incredible discovery. And dare I say, one of the most significant, really, in the history of human science and thought.
When you put it like that, it definitely sounds a lot more rational and also something that I never even thought about. So having you on, I think, is changing a lot of our minds, not just mine on this. I would quickly like to say thank you to Laura for the super sticker. Thank you. And I just have one more question for you here today. And that is, so we touched on missing 411 and the work of David Paulides, and there are so many mysterious cases of vanishings which have characteristics that repeatedly occur, such as people last being seen in a granite field, or bodies being discovered in granite fields with no outward signs of cause of death. And then those of like tiny infants going missing and being found bewildered 20 miles away with no injuries just within a day or two later, which is impossible for them to travel at such a distance. What do you think is going on with this?
Again, I guess we should be careful about drawing correlations. In one instance, there may be an explanatory mechanism that's very different from what occurs in another. Again, having read some of Mr. Paulides's research and owning a couple of those books myself, some of those cases are not easy to explain. I think that's the main point that David's trying to get across with his research, is that, guys, in some instances, it's not so simple as somebody just vanishing. Now, I'll tell you this. Some of the cases that he's investigated, I have personally investigated and spent a lot of time with. The Dennis Lloyd Martin case was a cornerstone for David's research. And unlike a lot of other researchers, to his credit, David spoke to the late Mr. William Martin, the father of the missing boy. David also spoke to a number of other family members and, has really tirelessly worked that case. And so, rightly, when he gave his presentation at the Great Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference back in the summer, talking about that case, there's an air of, from David, like he seems very protective of the case, because I do think that a few people have attacked him and things like this on podcasts and have, taken issue with his perspectives on the case. Having looked at the case myself, the only place where I would maybe differ slightly is that, David notes, as was reported in the newspapers at the time, and this is absolutely true, that there was a sighting of a man near the Cades Cove area by a Mr. Harold Key at the time. I think that especially since David's books have come out, people have really kind of honed in on that aspect of the case and tried to say, well, it must have been a Sasquatch, which David has never said. David has never said that. Harold Key was interviewed right before his death by a colleague of mine named Mike Bouchard, who is a police officer up in the northeastern United States. And Harold Key said, oh, no, it definitely wasn't a Sasquatch. It was a man, as was reported at the time. And he, I think, was like, wearing a rough looking kind of white T-shirt and stuff. And he ran out of the woods, jumped into a car, and spun gravel as he left. So again, that seems to be the real story. The problem, of course, is that a lot of very imaginative people look at stories like this and they take things out of context and they kind of add layers of mythology and things onto what again was intended always to be very factual, kind of, bland, serious reporting that guys like David Paulides and others have tried to present on this case without making extraordinary claims. And I know that for my own part, the Dennis Martin case is heartbreaking because the young boy vanished within feet of his father and his grandfather. It was the largest search effort by the National Park Service at that time. He was never found. I have filed FOIAs with every agency that I could find had been involved with the case, and I've been there. Unlike most researchers who've written about it, I've been to the location where he vanished. I've filmed and took photographs there. I've done everything I could, and I don't think we'll ever resolve that case. And troubling as it is, after so many years, more than 50 years, the FBI does have a fairly lengthy file about the boy's disappearance, which it will not release. McMillan and I have tried to make some inroads to try and get that file released. through FOIA, but for whatever reason, the FBI still won't release it. And I suspect I know why, but I don't think it's a huge mystery. I think it's because there's so much information, and there are still living family members of the missing boy who, after all this time, it's still painful for them. So, again, with respect to David and other people who have done so much research into that case, some of these cases are not easily explained. What happened to that child? How did David run up the trail and just vanish into thin air? And they didn't find a blood trail, they didn't find a shoe, nothing. There was literally nothing ever found about that boy. And there are some anecdotal claims of how, of many years later, remains that may have belonged to a small child being found a fair distance away. But then the question comes up of, how did the boy get down there? What happened? Now, again, back to your main point, a lot of these cases involve infants or small children that seem to travel great distances. And in some cases, unlike poor little Dennis, and it breaks my heart still talking about that case, but some of those children do turn up. But how did they travel that distance? They couldn't have made that trek on their own. And some of those same problems arise in the Dennis Martin case, where people say, well, if the body turned up in this location, as was described by some illegal ginseng hunters in the late 70s or early 80s, Dennis must have wandered down there. I'm like, look, I've been there. Okay, I've been there. A child, 5.5, 6 years old, doesn't wander for miles over rugged terrain through thick brush like that. And not to say that they necessarily couldn't, but it would be a monumental feat for that child. So there are aspects of a lot of these cases that remain unresolved, aren't easily explained. I can't say that there is a distinctive singular phenomena that unites all those cases. In fact, I won't say that. But I will say that on a case-for-case basis, there are aspects of these, as David and others have pointed out, that aren't easily explainable. And again, that's why so many of us have poured time into these cases trying to understand what's actually going on and what it all means. And some of these cases, we may never know the circumstances that led to these disappearances.
Micah, that is it for today's show. I want to say thank you so much for being here. Can you tell people who's going to be the next guest on your Micah Hanks podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, to tell you the truth, I think that the next episode, if all goes according to plan, I'm going to try and provide a full report on my investigations into mysterious phenomena in the Chapadas dos Veadeiros in Brazil. That is really interesting, but there's going to be a lot of work getting that together. And in the weeks ahead, I've reached out to a few other guests, but since none of them have confirmed at the moment, I think I'll have to keep it on the DL as to who to expect. But I can guarantee you one thing. If you listen to the Micah Hanks program, it's always going to be a fun time, a riveting conversation, and some thought-provoking dialogue.
Oh my gosh, all the time, every single time. Can't go wrong with watching or listening to his podcast. So I want to say thank you to everyone that has been here. Thank you for all the moderators for all the great work you guys do. Thank you to everyone who has donated to the channel with awesome and incredibly interesting super chat questions. And thank you to all of my Patreon supporters who this show would not be possible without you guys. As for my Patreon supporters, Mike and I will be doing an extra 15 minutes of Q&A, which will be posted on later, and coming up soon, a new show on Fridays, which will panel guests for a chat show called Strange Paradigms, giving you, yes, you, a chance to come on the show. So it's going to be open panel for anyone to show up. So I'll release more information soon about the show on the website at paradigmshifts.blog. I want to say thank you to everyone once again. Have a great night. Be safe. And remember, keep your eyes on the skies.